Are you struggling with trimming your pieces? Well, you are in luck because in this week's video, I'm going to be going over 10 tips and tricks about trimming that I wish I knew when I started. So if that's something that you want to learn about, stick around and find out what they are. So we're going to get started and trim this piece, and I'm going to go over 10 tips and tricks that will help you trim your pieces and hopefully prevent mistakes and or issues that occur when you are getting your piece to get finished, because trimming can make or break a piece, literally. So the tip number one that I have is to make sure that your rim is completely level. Now, normally you want to make sure it's level and you cut it level when you are throwing it, but sometimes you forget, or if you cut it and you think it's level but it's not when you come back, now's the time to get it level before you flip it upside down and center. So you can either cut the rim now while it's still stuck to the bat if it doesn't release, or after you cut it off and you pop it off, then you can cut it. But because when I pick up my piece, it's still stuck to the bat, now is a good time to cut the rim. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and lock it into the pegs, and we're going to be cutting this rim using an X-Acto knife. So when you cut the rim, what I recommend doing is after you start spinning the wheel, I do recommend you trim the rim to make it into a point. And the reason for that is when you have a point, it's much easier to cut it level because there's less clay for you to actually cut, and there's only one high point. Versus if it is not pointy and it's flat, you may cut not completely level across. So what I like doing is I bevel one side, so I trim one side at an angle at a 45 degree, and then I trim the opposite side, the inside, at that same angle. And I keep going back and forth until both sides are touching each other in the middle to create a point. And then once I have that point, I get my X-Acto knife, and when I cut, you can either push forward from 6 o'clock, resting your hands on the splash pan or your legs, or you can try to cut across like you normally do when you are cutting your piece when it's on the wheel. For this method, if you have really steady hands, I do recommend holding it at 6 o'clock, and then you're looking at the height, so this part right here. You don't want to cut at the very top, you want to go down about halfway down the bevel. So I'm going halfway down the bevel. Once it's touching the clay, I then slowly inch it forward. So I'm not lifting it, I'm not lowering it, I'm just going straight. So this does take a little practice. And once you cut all the way through, I stop the wheel and I lift up, and I can remove that unlevel part. And then I feel the rim, if it feels pretty good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just round the rim a little bit with some water, use my fingers to smooth. And now, so tip number two is to dry your piece and then to rewire it off so you can get it off the board. So if you touch your piece and you notice that the clay is still too wet, you want to use a heat gun or a torch, in this case I have a heat gun, to dry your piece before you wire it off and try to pop it off. Now normally you want to let it air dry naturally, but sometimes you just don't have time, or if it was wrapped up too good and you're there, you can't really just wait because it'll take hours. So heat gun will work in that case. But my piece is dry, it feels dry enough, so I'm actually going to rewire it off because right now it's stuck. Now normally when you throw on a plastic board, the bottom doesn't dry out, but everything else does. So if you were to try to just pick it up from the piece, it's stuck. You could try to pry it off, but normally that bends your clay because, like I said, the bottom's wet. So what I recommend is actually rewiring your piece off. So when you wire your piece off, if you pull from away towards you, you then want to pick up the side that is closest to you, because that is the point where the wire passes the last. If you go from towards you to away from you, you want to pick it up from away from you, because that is the point where the wire touches last there. So wherever the wire touches last, that is the part that is the least stuck, and that's where you should lift from. So if I pull towards me, I'm going to pull it right here where my thumbs are off. So I pull towards me, and then I pick it up right there, and it should release nicely. Now from here, we're going to dry it. So we're going to take the board out, and if you wanted to dry the top, because the top might still be wet, you grab your heat gun or your torch. In this case, I have a heat gun. This is from Amazon. I'll put it on my Amazon storefront. This one I like because there is adjustable dial to change the heat to make it hotter or lower. And then there's two settings, low and high. to dry your piece, and that changes the amount of air that comes out, not the heat. So right now I have it set to around 400 degrees. I'm going to spin the wheel a little slowly, turn it on low. I'm going to keep it about 6 inches away from the piece. I'm just going to spin it and then let the heat kind of dry the top. And the amount of time you dry it just depends on how wet the clay is. So it can take anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Anything beyond that, you may just want to throw another piece. Another tip / hack I have is you don't really want to be there holding it. So what you can do, especially on the bottom, because my bottom's wet and I need to dry it, you flip your piece upside down, and then you get some cardboard or some sort of material to wall this area off. So I have both a cardboard box and a sheet of cardboard. So the sheet of cardboard I'm going to wrap around here. So that creates this little border here. And I'm going to take this cardboard box and put it on top to create a little roof. And then I'm going to take my heat gun. I'm going to set it up right in front of the opening. I'm going to put it on top of an object. In this case, it's on a container. Ideally, you probably want to put it on a container that's metal, so in case this gets hot, this doesn't melt. And then you turn it on. And then you turn on the wheel to let it spin slowly. And then you let this run and you check it every minute or so. So depending on how wet it is, this is a good way to let your piece dry out. That's hands-free, you can walk away and take care of something else in the time being. So we're gonna go ahead and let this dry a little bit because the bottom's wet, and then we'll come back when it's ready. Okay, I think that's good. Let's check. Yep, that feels so much better. So now we are ready to trim. Now that the piece is dry, we're going to go ahead and tap center. And you don't really want to tap center if your piece is too wet, because what might happen is your piece, if it's wet and you hit it, you might dent it. So make sure that your piece is dry enough, and we're going to go ahead and tap center this so that we can get this trimmed. Tip number 3 I have is once you rip your wads and you get them ready to put and secure, tip number 3 is to not push the wads into the clay wall. This is really important to remember because oftentimes when students are beginning, sometimes the clay is a little too soft. And when they start pushing the clay into the wall, it bends and buckles the rim, causing it to deform. So when you push and put these wads down, gently push the side so it wraps around it, but you're not pushing it hard into the piece. You then push it down into the wheel head. And the pressure from your finger pushes the clay gently into the piece to secure it. So once again, you gently wrap and then you push down. Because it's really sad to see people's pieces get deformed when they pop it off because they were just a little too aggressive when they added these clay wads to their piece. Okay, so that is to get it secure. Don't push your clay wads into the piece because it will deform. But an even better way to get it secure without using wads is my tip number 4. And that is to use water tension on the rim to get your piece stuck so you don't even need wads. So let's get this removed. And let's talk about the water tension technique. So the water tension technique, you just take your piece, you get a little bit of water, and you put it on the rim. Then you put water on the wheel head as well. And you're going to take your piece and put it on top. And then you're going to move it around to start creating slip. You're going to feel your piece slide around. So if I tap it, you can see it slides quite easily. But the moment you start building more slip, you'll feel that tension grow, that slip gets thicker, and then it's going to be harder and harder for it to move. So once you start feeling it getting a little more stuck, you slow your movements, and then you manually find where it's off center. You gently nudge it to center. It's going to be much harder to move, so it may move more than what you want. And then you just center here. And this is a very great technique to learn because once you do it, from my experience, it does save time and it reduces your chances of needing to use wads. The only downside of using this technique is if your piece is really wet and you try to use the water tension technique, your walls are going to really just buckle under the pressure that you move back and forth. So make sure that your clay is dry enough when you do this water tension technique. So I got it to where I want it. I spin the wheel slowly. I give it a light tap to make sure it's extra stuck, or I can just gently push down. And then I do a light jiggle. It feels really secure. So before I start trimming, one thing that I like doing is I like trimming a little pilot hole here, a little indent. And this will allow me to apply downwards pressure with my left hand, and then I can support my right with this part so that this piece won't fly off. Now, before I actually start removing everything, another sub tip, if you notice that your rim is already starting to be off center, use a tool like a needle or an X-Acto knife and then make a center line for yourself. So you know everything beyond this line is off center. You know that once you trim to this edge, everything should be true and centered. So tip 5 that I have is about the angle that you should hold the trimming tool and the pressure. So angle when you trim, you should have your trimming tool at a 45-degree angle. This is the best in terms of the leverage you can apply pressure, and it allows this to get a nice sharp carve into it. If you go too flat, oftentimes it doesn't carve a lot out, and if you go too wide, it can kind of skip and kind of gouge. But if you have a nice 45-degree, you can get a consistent ribbon. Now pressure, you don't want to apply heavy pressure right away because that will grip the clay and your hand will gouge and then kind of get moved by the wheel. So you want to apply light pressure at that 45-degree angle, and you increase the pressure until you start seeing a steady stream of ribbons come off or trimmings. Once you have that steady stream, keep the pressure the same because that is the pressure that you need to apply for your particular piece and its dryness. And so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to continue trimming like I normally would, and then with my finger on here, my left hand on here, I'm going to brace my piece. And then I'm just going to start trimming away any clay I have on the overhang. And then this part you trim as much or as little away as possible. And I want my foot to get established. So I'm trimming away the overhang, and then I'm going to go ahead and then turn my hand like it's a doorknob. Like I'm turning a doorknob to get vertical to establish my foot. And a little bump of clay developed there, so I'm going to remove that. And then there I have my foot more or less established, and then I can kind of feather this trimming down a little bit to round it out. In my previous trimming video, I used a needle to mark foot lines. You don't necessarily need to do that, but as you're learning, it does help. If you're just trimming just by eyeball and you realize your foot is too wide for your liking, what I like doing is I take my trimming tool, I hold it at an angle, 45, I bevel that corner away, and then I slowly just start turning the tool vertical to then make a new foot edge. I'm going to switch to a new trimming tool, switch to my bigger trimming tool, and then I'm going to get this feathered out and remove all the excess trimmings that I don't need to see. Okay, my piece is probably the wettest I would like it because the trimmings are kind of sticking to itself. But sometimes as you trim, you may encounter your piece that's more dry and the trimmings are coming off as little flakes. So if that happens, those trimmings that come off as flakes can turn into dust really easily, and if you trim even drier, dust is actually being created, and it actually wears out your trimming tools because it carves away, it grinds away the metal. So this next clip will show you how to hydrate your piece with a little water so that you don't encounter dust and you get back to creating beautiful long ribbons. Now, as I go down, you can see my trimmings are coming off as more flakes and ribbons, and that's because that's too dry. So what you can do is you can add a little bit of water on your sponge, coat the area that's too dry with water, so you hydrate the outermost part of the clay, go back, and then start trimming that same area, and then you should notice the trimmings coming off as ribbons again. Now the only downside about hydrating your clay as you trim is the ribbons, the trimmings will most likely get stuck to the wet surface. So it'll just require a little more cleanup. All right, getting back to this piece, we're almost ready to start the next tip, but I'm gonna go ahead and just feather this curve out. I want it a little less bulby and more angled down. So trim that down. All right, and then now I'm ready to start trimming the inside. So I like starting with a smaller tool. And when you trim the bottom, I always like having my bottom slightly domed because that allows less pressure to be placed on the bottom. Because if it's flat, it has more tension across the span of your foot, and that can cause cracks to develop. So if you slope it, it looks a little more fine-tuned and elegant with your piece, and it helps relieve some pressure. And when I slope it, I like making the middle the top of the slope, and then it slopes downwards towards the edge of the foot, and then the height of this part, it's not here yet, but the height of this part should match the height over here. So I always start in the middle, and now I hold it like a pencil, start from the middle, and I work my way outwards, and I slow down as I get towards my foot. So I'm left-handed, so I'm going to go ahead and use my left hand, and then as I use my left hand, I'm trimming towards 430 instead. Yep. And as I'm setting the height of my middle, once I get the height of my middle, I'm going to make sure that everywhere around it matches that height, and then I'm slowly going to slope it down. So tap for thickness, that feels good for the thickness here. Now I'm going to slope the other area. So that's where a good wide trimming tool comes into play. And then now I'm just going to make sure everything matches the height. And then I'm going to start sloping the clay. So then I'm turning it like that doorknob technique again, but focusing the pressure on the right side of the tool to then slope the bottom to make it match. Now to get this down, because this is too wide, you can either start above where you want to trim and trim straight down if you have a steady hand. But sometimes that skips and you end up trimming into the main part of your foot. So a more secure way that I learned is trimming at midnight. And you gently just push the tool towards midnight, and that tends to remove little increments, and the odds of you skipping upwards, as long as you're trimming slowly, are a lot less. So I'm going to get my thickness there. Now I can remove these bumps here, and now my height here matches more or less the height here. So if I were to cut this ring off, I have a nice gentle slope across the piece. All right, so tip number 8 is adding some flair or style to your foot. Now there's nothing wrong with having a straight foot, but sometimes when you glaze it, you want to be able to hold your piece by the foot. And if you don't have a corner here that is grippy, it might be a little more difficult to hold. So what I like doing is creating an undercut or a slight indent. So undercut would just be taking your trimming tool, and then you're just trimming your foot, and you're just angling it into the middle of your piece to create a little flare. So then I'm going to switch to my smaller tool and kind of clean up the trimmings that got stuck to itself. And this little undercut that I added, because it's more flared out, it will be easier to grip with your fingers. Now if you want something a little more stylish, instead of doing an undercut, you can do a curved foot. I'm going to go ahead and trim this angled part to make it more straight again. And then instead of making it flared out, I'm going to make it curved. So I take the curved part of my tool, the round part, and I'm just going to trim a little indent. And this little indent will allow me to grip it a little more, and it just adds a little more of a stylish bottom. Now the downside of this little indent is if you go really thin on this part, it's more prone to chipping. So what I like doing is I then kind of trim away that point and make it a little rounder, but not too round because I still want to be able to grip it. And so there we go. I got my piece more or less fine-tuned and trimmed and ready to start the next tip, tip number 9, and that is to burnish and to smooth the piece so that I can remove all these trimmings and trimming marks. So before I can burnish, I got to remove all these old trimmings. So let's knock these off and collect them with the trimming tool. Sometimes I put my finger behind the tool to collect them. Sometimes you can dip it in water and then use that to collect any trimmings that may have gotten stuck. Whatever technique you use to collect your trimmings, go ahead and take care of all those little bits. So to burnish and to smooth the piece, you just take a wet sponge, you add a little bit of water where you want to focus your smoothing, and you can smooth with a rubber silicone rib or a wooden tool, but I prefer my fingers because you can really feel the clay. And what I'm doing is I'm applying very light pressure and I'm pushing all of those trimming marks, all of those bumps, those dents, those little bits back into the clay, and it smooths the surface out nicely. And then now I'm going to move into the inside. And then you just got to be careful with your pressure. Sometimes if your bottom's a little on the thinner side, if you put too much pressure, you can concave it. And then you can see that this area where I smoothed looks much more refined than this area. So now I'm going to move on to this spot. And normally when you trim your piece on the drier side, the trim lines are a lot more noticeable. So burnishing and smoothing is something that I always recommend because I'm not the biggest fan of trim lines. And then to smooth areas your fingers are just too big to reach, a little bit of a small brush with a little bit of water on top will help smooth those little bits that your fingers are just a little too bulky. And this I kind of treat as like a trimming tool and then just smooth, mostly hitting the corners to kind of even out everything. Alright, now we're going to get this popped off and we're going to do the last tip of the video. So if you use the water tension technique to get it stuck, I like positioning the pegs on the left and the right, putting my hands around it, making sure they're dry, and then gently start wiggling until it releases. Now, as you wiggle, if your piece was really soft to begin with and you put it on, it's going to get pretty stuck. So just keep wiggling, let that tension slowly start to release, and eventually you should be able to pop this off. Okay, it's not releasing because it's got really stuck, so I'm going to try the other side and repeat. Now, if you keep doing it and it doesn't release, you might have to wire it off. So that is the downside of the water tension technique. Sometimes it works too well. There we go, starting to budge. And you could also try to turn the wheel and let it release. But what I actually just did, I turned the wheel and it released. I should have just pulled because my rim, if you can look for my overhead cam, got deformed. So a new tip that I wasn't planning to tell you guys is to recenter this. If you have a 3D printer, you can make one of these centering cones and use that to then push down to recenter. Or, I know not everybody have this, or if you have a bowl that's already round, you can use that as your rim cone or centering circle, whatever you want to call it, and use that to push down, and that will help recenter. So I just push this down into the piece and kind of rotate. Now you got to be careful because if your foot is really soft and wet, you may want to do this step a little later. Or you can kind of rotate the wheel and push the clay so that every part of your bowl is touching your rim. Alright, so now back to circle. And the last tip is tip number 10, to smooth the rim. So if the rim got messed up because it was stuck too much, like mine's did, take a sponge, add a little bit of water, and then use your fingers to then smooth this out to your liking. And because bowls, sometimes you put your lips against it, you don't really want corners, so I'm getting rid of those corners and then rounding everything else out. And there we go, we got my finished bowl. Had some hiccups along the way, and of course it gets stuck again, but we have the nice bowl. And just so that you guys understand why it was so wet, I actually threw this earlier today, so that was about 4 hours ago, and I just let it sit in front of fans. So you can definitely trim pieces you throw on the same day if you give it enough time to dry. Anyway, So we have the finished bowl. I hope those 10 tips, or 10 plus a little extra, will help you on your next trimming adventure to make your pieces exactly how you want it, with less issues and less headaches. So if you like these kind of videos, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can see the next week's video come out when it's released. And at this time, I want to say mahalo to all of the Mud Club members and a shout out to the Mud Club Plus members. We have Pamela K. Jameson, Sister Bragdon, and JJ Kiss. So if you want to join, the description has the info. So take a look, and hopefully I see all you folks as members in next week's video. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.